It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Doug Hall, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Scar Tissue: Overcoming Parental Wounds Through Faith. Doug, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's an honor for me to be here, and I look forward to our discussion. I hope it blesses people.
Well, Doug, truly my pleasure to have you on the show as well. I think we're going to start with this. Won't be my exact normal origin story question. I'd love to have you set us up just to see why you were the right person to pull this book together. So tell us about your journey with your dad, your journey of overcoming, and how you learned a lot of things that are relevant for what you share, and that we're going to talk about later about your new book.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. So this is definitely an experiential book. I'm writing it because it's my personal story, but I also believe that it's part of God's bigger story, and therefore it can be used to help bless other people, hopefully. But my dad was my hero, like a lot of young boys. He had been a fighter pilot. I looked up to him. He left Vietnam when I was 4 years old. He came back when I was five and a half. And, I could tell something had changed in that experience in his life. He wasn't the same. But at age 12, my parents were fighting quite often. And at age 12, he left our house, which was a shock. I had an older brother, 16, and we were just trying to survive. And emotionally, as a 12-year-old boy, when that happens, your whole world's kind of rattled and shaken. And I just felt lost. I did not grow up in a Christian household. We never went to church or anything like that. So this story is really about 25 years from when my dad left to when I encountered Jesus, of struggling and trying to deal with that wound that I had from a broken relationship with my father. And as I talk about in the book, it became my experience that really there's a couple different ways that it was affecting me. One is an abandonment issue. I felt my father had abandoned us, and I was always wondering why, or had I done something wrong. The second was a lack of affirmation, in that, as a young adolescent male, I was looking for father's affirmation. And when it wasn't there, it left a void. I felt empty. I felt less than. So I was constantly searching. And then that actually turned into anesthetized that pain, which took place, basically 37. And the third place I've seen this show up is verbal or emotional abuse. And the far end of that, it's physical abuse. Luckily, I didn't experience physical abuse, but I did experience verbal and emotional abuse. So that's what this book is focused on, is that pain of trying to cope with those symptoms, we call them, and then eventually encountering Jesus and how he led me to not only forgive my father, but also to tell the story in the hopes of other people. Because I serve at a very large church in Orange County, and it's not shocking to me, but I'm just always amazed at how God uses us when we're willing to be vulnerable, because so many kids come up for prayer, and that's kind of my position, people. Intercessory prayer. So many kids I talk to have a parent wound. So that's the hope for writing the book, is that it can touch other people, and they won't have to go through a 25-year pain. They can hopefully much sooner.
And in terms of like who the book is for, like on the one hand, I feel like with this kind of a book, we would end up writing a resource that we would have liked for ourselves in years past. But like, is there a certain age demographic, or like who is that ideal reader that you had in mind when you were putting this together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would have said something different a couple of years ago, but having written it now, it just came out just a couple months ago, and seeing who I'm praying with at church, it's really a spectrum, I would say, from 12 to about 30 years old. There's people, and it's both men and women. And it's not just dads. There's a lot of people, ladies and men, that have broken relationships with father. And so I've heard, that was my experience, but I've heard about kids saying that their mom left the house, and, what that's done to them. So I think it's a book that can be useful for anyone who's experienced a broken relationship with their parent, and any age, really. Because one of the things that that I had to come to grips with is you have to acknowledge your pain. So it requires some humility in that as men, especially, we like to fix our problems. And I finally got to a point where I literally was ready to just throw up my arms and say, I can't fix this. And I'm tired of carrying the burden and the pain. And luckily, I met Jesus, and he was the one that made me to be able to not only, heal from my brokenness, but also learn to forgive my father, which is a big part of this thing. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little.
Well, and it intrigues me too that you mentioned people coming up talking to you that they don't just have father woundedness, that there are those who have mother woundedness. I think there is a tendency over the and I'm coming at it from the perspective of like Christian publishing and things within the church. We had a lot of focus on deadbeat dads and fathers abandoning, and nobody ever talked about that. There are a lot of issues who have endured abuse and neglect and things with mothers in the home. And so that encourages me that you mentioned that, and then even with how you're ministering to people, that is coming up, and that people are seeking help in that area. I think just with where we're at culturally, we need to be willing to acknowledge that it isn't just that dads are sometimes the problem; it can be moms too, or both parents. I think you have the whole spectrum of just the hurt and the pain coming from all sides of, I guess, the couple, the parents, all whatever you might want to say. In terms of like the science of emotional scars, these traumas, these experiences we have, like, how do they affect us? How do we carry them into the future? Because I grew up without a dad. Did some counseling as a kid and whatnot, but I feel like these scars, they come up and they cause problems when you get married and become a parent yourself, and you have to start dealing with things and facing things. And I feel like the small thing is you didn't necessarily get mentored on how to be a good dad or be a good husband, but just as we're in the midst of living life, these wounds manifest and come up in the weirdest of places. So, in terms of those scars and the difficulty there, like, how does that affect people?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me personally, I'll speak to my personal experience, and I didn't acknowledge this for a long time, but I had a real commitment problem. I had a hard time committing to long-term relationship, um, and the one that I did have, especially one particular one, where I really loved the person, I could not get over the threshold, and take it over to becoming a father, because at that time, and a husband, sorry, I wasn't a Christian, and I didn't have the strength that Jesus provided to give me a new, like you said, a new role model, and teach me what it means to really be a man and a husband and a father, because I didn't have that role model in my father. So that was the main way it manifested itself. But yeah, I mean, I think it's there's a lack of trust, I would say, is one I hear a lot of. There's a hiding element to it, where you try to hide from having to deal with the pain. And I think, again, what is hidden cannot be, I put it in the book, what is denied cannot be healed. That takes a lot of courage to bring that into the light. It requires being vulnerable into admitting that you're wounded. And that's, again, tough for a lot of men. I talk to a lot of guys that I don't want to do. Um, and that's a resource. I mean, that's a natural reaction, I think. And I think I was kind of dealing with it that way, and also trying to anesthetize or numb that pain, kick the can down the road so I didn't have to deal with it. And there's lots of ways in this world to do that. You don't have to search far. You can find it on your phone. You can find it at the grocery store with alcohol or marijuana or whatever you want to do to numb that pain. But my reality was, at some point I had to deal with it, because the burden was growing, and it was crushing me. So.
And in terms of kind of the idea of faith rewiring trauma, when I hear that and thinking of rewiring, I picture new grooves being created in the brain and new patterns and old patterns that were destructive being healed. How does faith help in that process of healing and kind of maybe allowing us to stop pressing play on those old tapes, those old loops that keep coming up?
Yeah, that's actually exactly what happened to me. Is there was some scriptures I read as a baby Christian I just clung on to. And one of them in John 5:6, John asked the paralytic man that's been on the mat, really penetrating question. He's been on the mat for 40 something or 40 years roughly. And he says, "Do you want to get well?" And I remember reading that, and I had to say to myself, "Do I really want to get well?" And I said, "Yes, Lord, I want to get well." And then Matthew 11:28, Jesus invites us to take our heavy burdens from our shoulders and put them onto him. And I said, "Lord, if you're real, take this burden. I don't want to carry it anymore." And he did. And then Matthew 7:7, ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be open. And I was just literally knocking, asking, seeking, "Lord, if you're real, me, take this pain away from me." Those were scriptures that spoke right to me. And then Romans 12:2, the renewing of our mind. Over time, by immersing myself in the Word of God, He did rewire how I thought about a lot of things, but especially how I learned forgiveness, because I had a hardened heart towards my father. And what I learned, it was like I was drinking poison in my unforgiveness and hoping he got sick. He was living his life. He didn't even care. He didn't even know. And so when I learned to forgive my father, it was not only cathartic for me, but it showed me a pathway of how to engage with him and to speak to him in a way that he could kind of understand things I was feeling. And while our reconciliation never got to the level of what you would want between a son and a father, it did improve greatly. And we got to a place where we were able to say some kind words to each other, which that was a real blessing in my life to be able to do that. And then, God also taught me a lot of, you can learn what to do by learning what not to do. And so I learned how to be a good dad, I think, by learning what didn't work. And one of those main things was just being present. One of the stories I share with kids is like, you can fake a lot of things, but you can't fake showing up. And so if you're a dad, a young dad, or even the girls I pray with, a young mom, it's important that you show up for your kids, because that was what really gutted. One of the things that gutted me was I played hockey. I grew up in Buffalo, and my dad would always say, be at the games, and I'd be looking up in the crowd, first period, second period. He wasn't there. And I was like, oh, just late me. So, showing up is 9/10 of the, so, hope that helps.
And then the idea of community and healing. I feel like if we try to tackle and deal with these kinds of just deep seated issues alone, one, we're never going to provoke ourselves to deal with them. But also, I think we are designed to be communal people. We need support and just, I think, the back and forth sometimes with another person to process and move forward. So, in terms of community in the healing process to recover from these mother and father wounds, why do we need to stop thinking we need to be John Wayne and go it alone?
Yeah, I think it's dangerous to try to do this alone. I think you're right. You need to be able to share your experiences. It's great if you can get around like-minded people or other people that won't judge you and just are willing to listen. Sometimes my wife was my sounding board. She's the one that led me to the Lord, and she had incredible advice and how she listened to me. That was her advice, was listening and basically empathizing with me. She's filled with empathy. And then she would slowly intercede with some scriptures I should read or some thoughts I should have, and ask me to pray on it. And so this is something I think if you're alone and isolated, it's going to be hard. I would encourage you to get into community, and to ask people to pray for you. Ask people, hey, can I share something with you that's pretty personal? As if you have real friends, they want what's best for you, and they'll notice if you're willing to be vulnerable and share. They'll notice the pain it's causing in your life, and they'll want to help you. And sometimes that's just by being with you. Just like we all suffer pain in this life. I mean, get older, you realize, pain, misery is optional, but pain is inevitable. I mean, we're going to go through painful experiences, and having a broken parental relationship is if it starts at a young age, it does have ramifications, like you said, later in life. And so surround yourself with community, surround yourself with people that you can trust, can lean on. Because I tried doing it alone for a little while and that didn't work. So.
And I think the this latter kind of home stretch of the interview, I'd like to focus on kind of the healing journey, the process you walk people through in the book, and so I want to just pull on a couple of the themes there. Talk to us about the importance of being vulnerable. Like I feel like that's an important first step. Where that's the last thing we absolutely like we want to do, but that's where we need to start. We need to get to a place where we understand that we have to be vulnerable and start, maybe pulling some of that scab off and to let that wound finally air out. But that can be a very hard first step because so much of this we've had bottled inside for, if not years, multiple decades. So many of us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That was the hardest first step, because when you're willing to be vulnerable, it's just that you're exposing your emotions to a whole different realm that you haven't experienced before. Because, like I said, for 25 years, I just tried to anesthetize the pain, kick the can down the road, not feel it. But then what I realized as I got older is when I woke up from the buzz or the party or whatever it was, I was just worse off than I'd been the night before. I just literally, I hadn't dealt with the root cause. I was trying to numb the symptom. So for me, being vulnerable was raising my hand, acknowledging my need for a Jesus Christ Savior, and then asking Him to reveal those areas of my life where I needed healing, and to invite Him into those wounded areas. And literally, someone early on in my faith walk said, the Bible can be summarized like this: in the beginning, dot dot dot, help. And I said, I need help, Lord. I need your help to heal this wounded relationship. I can't do it on my own. Please help me. Please guide me. And an ironic thing is, the first time I became a Christian, the first sermon I was listening to, pastor was speaking a sermon. I had very not a great idea of what he was even talking about. I'll never forget the title. It was called "Only the Wounded Soldiers Can Fight in Christ's Army." And I was like, I'm wounded. So I listened pretty intently to what he was saying. And he had been an alcoholic, and he talked about how Christ had healed his wound and his alcoholism that he'd used to hide from his pain. And that was I would call it a very important first step in realizing that there's a lot of people that are wounded, and there's other people who can help guide you. So he was a great first resource to ask questions of and stuff. But yeah, you're not alone. I want to say that there's a lot of people that are wounded in this world from a lot of different things. And my story is unique, but in a way, it's not, because some of the same things that I did to find healing, other people can do. That is being vulnerable, asking God to help you, finding scriptures that speak to you, and just really believing and trusting. I believe, that's a challenge for everyone in their faith walk, is how much do we really trust? And I learned that God's word had to be the guiding roadmap for my life, because when I was in charge, I just went to the default position, which was not very healthy for me. And it was, yeah, it caused a lot of pain. But being vulnerable is the first step. And I would say being humble, and that, again, acknowledging that you can't fix it on your own. Those kind of go hand in hand. Then it's a process, and you have to learn to be patient with yourself. You have to be patient. It's not going to happen overnight. This took me several years of asking, knocking, and having God work in my life before I really had that breakthrough where I was able to truly forgive my father. And what I found is, when I asked Jesus to teach me how to forgive my father, that burden I'd been carrying, it was like a giant gorilla on my back. It was removed, and I felt a freedom I hadn't felt in a long time, because he really did take that burden, put it on him. That's a great promise that we find again in Matthew 11.
I think too, just getting to that place where you realize that you're not alone, and that is going to take being vulnerable and humble and being willing to talk with other people. But we always assume that everybody else around us, all the shiny, happy people, like their lives must be perfect. And woe is me. I've had the worst life ever. I have all the problems. And when you start to get into other people's lives, you quickly find out, wow, they're as screwed up as I am, or their childhood was as terrible as mine was. Or you meet people who are like, oh my gosh, my everything is so tame compared to what you endured. So, we always assume everybody else had it so good and so perfect and so wonderful, and it's oddly comforting when you start to see that you're not alone, and there's lots of other people that have endured the same things that you've endured. I feel like it gives us an opportunity or permission to be like, oh wait, I'm normal, because like I'm not some strange outcast with this whatever, once kind of in a lifetime situation. So I feel like that's an interesting side effect of when we do talk to other people and begin to see that there's lots of other folks, and I think too, like we can hear about it, we can read about it. It's different when you're talking one on one with others and kind of sharing and just whatever. I feel like it gives us permission just to be like, okay, like, to see like where you're at or where I'm at, and others be like, well, you're okay. Like you've overcome these things. Like I feel like there's a whole aspect of hope in there that only comes through sharing with other people who've been where you've been.
Yeah, I apologize for the dog barking in the background. Part of the risk of doing a Zoom from home, right? The
Absolutely.
mailman decided to come right now. It's a little bit early. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think one to one, a lot of things can happen that, like you said, if you read about it, it seems oh good for them type of thing. But when we realize that it's okay to not be okay, and to understand that we do all have some brokenness in our life. I think on the outside, if you looked at my life as a kid, you think, gosh, he has it all because wealth and all that stuff was all around me. And I guess God was already teaching me at a young age that wealth doesn't equate happiness, because I came from a fairly well-to-do family that had brokenness everywhere. And so already I was being taught lessons I didn't even know how important they would be later in life. So yeah, I think it's important to I try to teach my kids the social media and stuff, the perils of comparison, because everyone puts their best foot forward on social media, and we've heard people say Facebook should really be called fake book because it's all everyone's best putting their best foot forward, but that's not real life. Everyone's struggling with something, and I think it's important to have friends that surround you that understand, that take the time. I call them 2 a.m. friends. You're lucky to have one or two of those in your life, to be honest. But if your whole world collapses and it's 2 in the morning, who are you going to call? And it's not Ghostbusters. You gotta have a friend that you can rely on, and I've been lucky that I have some men in my life that I can do that with, and I've needed them. And they're some are much older. One gentleman's 80, and he's been a great mentor to me, and some are younger. And I think we can learn from everybody in our life. I think God puts people in our life for a reason. Some just for a short period of time, and some for a lifetime, to teach us valuable lessons and to learn. And like you said, I think it's a great point, Shaun. God made us to do life together. It's one of the things I love technology. I love being able to do my job from Australia or wherever and call in and talk to my family and be on a screen. But sometimes it can be isolating too. And I think we have to be careful because we need face to face, cheek to cheek interaction, especially when we're dealing with something like an emotional wound that needs. And so it is so personal. I think if we try to deal with it remotely, it's maybe not going to be as effective as getting face to face and speak, like you said, and kind of hashing it out one on one with somebody.
Yeah, and in terms of social media, I mean, the majority of it is a highlight reel of all the good things, and that's fine. We're excited about the good things in our life, and so we want to share about them. But just remember that everybody's life is very multifaceted, and you're only seeing a small snippet of what their reality is. So yeah, that whole comparison trap is definitely a ditch to learn not to fall into. I think the place I'd kind of like to land the conversation, which on the one hand, I think this is sort of the hope in a lot of these situations. Not always possible if our parent is, already gone into the afterlife, so to speak. But a reconciliation, and I realize for different reasons, for some people, that's maybe not possible, and so maybe that's not something you're going to be able to shoot for. But I can say in my own journey, being able to reconcile with my father was one of the greatest gifts I've had in my life, and really allowed me to have so much closure on things that I would regret that he actually passed away within like a year and a half of us reconciling. So I'm very thankful that we got to have some hard conversations and some heart to heart conversations. But that I feel like that's probably the hardest step, because there's so much fear of just being rejected in that same way that you felt like you have been rejected often in your whole life. So just the good, the
Yeah.
bad, the difficulty of reconciliation. Like it's so freeing, but that's probably the whole, I would say, is like the scariest part of the journey, at least from my perspective.
Absolutely agree with everything you just said. Yeah, for me it was, and I just remember praying and God, Jesus speaking to me to right to my heart, and you need to take the first step. And I remember kind of arguing, which is kind of funny in hindsight to see as a baby Christian, arguing with the Lord. Tell me I'm not too prideful, right? Like, oh Lord, He's the one that hurt me, and He's the one that should be coming forward, and all this. But no, write a letter to your father and tell him you forgive him for everything he's ever done. So I literally wrote a 12-page tear-filled letter with my wife sitting next to me, forgiving him for everything that he had done. And again, a very cathartic experience. Felt so light after that. And I remember calling him probably 2 weeks later, and said, Dad, did you get my letter? Yeah. Did you read it? No, I didn't really understand it, but yeah, I got it. But that had been an icebreaker, and that allowed me to have some conversations like you. I think it's really important. Of course, it takes two to tango, but it was important to make that first step and to have some level of reconciliation. Because also, like you might ask, not too long after that, and it would have been really hard to not have taken that step, and give yourself credit for taking that step. Like you said, Shaun, you can't guarantee the other party's going to respond, and you can't make them. But there's something that happens inside of us when we take that. We've we've been obedient to the Lord. We've done what He asked us to do, and now the outcome's in His hands, and that's very liberating. And so God did work again. It didn't get to the place where I would kumbaya and where I wanted to be, but it was a lot better at the end than it was at the beginning. And so again, don't put too much stress on it. Don't put too much pressure, because it's a journey. It's a journey on both sides. And I didn't learn until much later in life, my dad's personal story, that he had been raised very cold, lack of affection type of household, away to military school at a young age, fighting in a war in his late 20s. So, it helped give me perspective. And then, the learning that takes place in that process is, we can learn a little bit about God's grace, and learning to have grace towards the way that God has grace for us. And He forgives us all of our sin, as far as the east is from the west, and through Christ Jesus and what He did for us on the cross. So I learned for the first time how to have grace towards my father. And that helped me, in a way, long term, become a better dad. And then the last part of it is just, so the next step of that is, if you feel passionate about what you've learned or what God's done in your life, then can you give back? In this case, my giving back was, writing the book, Scar Tissue, because I think it's something that hopefully can be a roadmap to healing, that other people can benefit from. And again, my part was to write the book, and it's in God's hands. And like you said at the very beginning, is really beautiful. Like, hopefully the right people hear this message, and they can get the help that they need. And, there's a lot of resources back of the book. You can find counseling and other types of help besides spiritual help. But yeah, I think, to summarize, reconciliation is critical. And I think my advice would be, even if it's totally uncomfortable, try to get yourself to take the first step. you'll see a lot of growth just by doing that.
Well, and I want to touch on something Doug said about, a letter. If your parent is deceased, I would still encourage you to write that letter to say the things you were never able to say. And after my father passed away, I spent some time working with a counselor, and that's one of the things he had me do is, write a letter, even if it's really long, about all the things you would have said if you had one more day to say all the things that were left unsaid. And so just having the opportunity to write that, and then I read that to the counselor, and we talked through it and such, and it was probably a huge freeing turning point in that journey of saying goodbye. So even whether it's that they're deceased or just because of circumstances, reconciliation, like face to face or even contact communication is impossible. I would encourage you to write that letter and find somebody you can read it to, who can just listen and encourage you, and give you a hug, give you a box of Kleenex because you're probably going to cry through it, and just but there is something very freeing of getting all of that out of you onto paper, reading it as if you're reading it to that person. I feel like that is a way you would be able to really unburden yourself from a lot of the stuff that you've been carrying for many years. So, if they can receive the letter, awesome. If that's impossible, it might seem a little goofy to do it, but I can guarantee you it's going to help in your healing process.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that was you put it really well. And it was a great learning moment for me is I was writing it thinking it was going to benefit my father. And really it benefited me because inside I still needed more healing. And God took that scalpel to those really deep areas of my life and showed me his love. I created space for his love into me to allow a little bit of his for the first time. And that felt really good in my soul. And I think you're right. I mean, even if your loved ones, in a way, my dad was physically alive, but he had been emotionally dead for 5 years. So writing that letter, really alive, is really important because you're going to get a lot out of it. You're going to release everything you just said. It's going to be so. I would encourage.
Doug, in terms of this might be a complex question, but like reader takeaway, if the person who reads through the book and kind of works through what you suggest, if they have one key thread that they pull from the book, or maybe it's how would you like to see their life changed on the other side of journeying with the book? Like what's that takeaway, that result you'd like to see for every reader?
I think I'd say two. One is forgiveness, learning to forgive those who have hurt us. Because again, the unforgiveness is like we're drinking poison, hoping the other person gets. And that, like you said before, Sean, that manifests in many different ways. It can manifest in emotional problems. It can manifest in physical problems. So learning forgiveness over time. Again, be patient. Give yourself lots of grace, and then the redemption part of your story, using your story to try to help, so you can give them the baton further down the road, and maybe they don't have to struggle like I did for 25 years. So my goal is like, hey, if I can. I prayed with a kid that was 12 the other day, and I said, this is amazing. My dad left. Like, yeah, my dad's married, and I'm 12. I was able to talk to him and give him some advice through my story that I hope will really help him. And in the very short time we had together, 10 minutes, he was crying, I was crying. And, I felt like this healing bond was already beginning. And so, I think our God is a God of redemption. Anytime we can use our stories to help other people, I would encourage you to look at it through that. It's not natural. We kind of, my story for a long time was I kind of like to be a victim. When you're a victim, you don't have any responsibilities. Just play the victim. And so I had to grow out of that. And again, with Christ's love, and learn to see my story as part of his story that can be used to help people. Those would be the two takeaways. Learn to forgive yourself and whoever wounded you, and then how to redeem that betterment of humanity.
And Doug, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about the book, where can we discover you on the web?
Sure. Social media is at Doug Hall Media. or my website is DougHallMedia.com. The book, Scar Tissue, Overcoming Parental Wounds Through Faith, is available on the website. It's also available on Amazon.com. So I encourage you, if it's a subject that would be relevant to you, that pick it up, and you can always email me directly through the website, and look forward to engaging with you one-on-one, and hopefully we can share some stories, and hope the book touches you and blesses.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to Doug's website, as well as links to places where you can pick up your very own copy of his brand new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Doug Hall. Once again, our book today was Scar Tissue, Overcoming Parental Wounds Through Faith. And Doug, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.